once again, hello. I'm Taylor McEwen, Collections and Exhibitions Curator at the South Dakota Art Museum.
And I'll introduce myself again. I'm Abigail Ramsbottom, Curator of Education at the museum.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the third virtual artist chat featuring artists from the South Dakota Governor's 10th Biennial Exhibition. The Biennial Exhibitions aim to recognize and encourage South Dakota artists, to promote the artistic identity of South Dakota, and to foster a larger sense of community and connection among artists within the state. We're also happy that you've joined us this afternoon. The biennials are in large part made possible through the generous grant funding from the South Dakota Arts Council. This virtual artist chat is made possible through the generous support of donors like you. Because the South Dakota Art Museum receives operational funding from South Dakota State University and the South Dakota Arts Council, your donations, memberships, and gifts fund fantastic exhibitions and programs like this. Thank you.
Shortly, we'll hear from 4 artists featured in the biennial whose work is on display at the South Dakota Art Museum in Brookings until May 14th. Joining us this afternoon are artists Amanda Boerger, Carol Gooey, Susan Heggestad, and Mark Stemwedel. Each artist will share about themselves and their artwork, followed by a brief Q&A. Please save questions for the end of the program or feel free to put them into the chat throughout. I'll introduce each artist and moderate the Q&A at the end of the program. So we're starting off with Amanda Boerger tonight. Amanda Boerger is a multimedia artist living and working in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. She received a bachelor's degree in French Studies and Studio Arts from South Dakota State University, as well as 2 respective certificates in modern and contemporary art history and printmaking. Boerger uses collage, sculpture, and printmaking to explore psychological phenomena, American culture, and the human condition more broadly. Amanda?
Hi. All right, so I'm here to talk to you today about my biennial piece. So you'll see that featured there. We see some of my friends have mentioned this looking a bit like a baby caterpillar. But what I was trying to convey is my daughter. So my work has always aimed to show life and really recognizable imagery throughout life. And this is kind of what my life looks like right now. So I had my first child 14 months ago. This painting would have been done when she was about 6 months old, when I was preparing for a show at USD called Matrescence. So it's a very real moment from my life. So the title Pass You By, it's one shows my daughter crawling and passing me by, but also it's trying to convey just kind of the blurriness and of all of this change, this rapid change that I'm going through now and that I see my daughter going through. So that's that in a nutshell. On the right, you'll see a photo of me that was from a recent online publication called Sioux Falls Stage and Gallery, and they featured me for their January edition. All right, so Pass You By. I know, Abigail, one of the questions you asked in your email prompt was, how is this similar or dissimilar to other pieces? So this one is very dissimilar from my other work in that it's a very different style. So it's a lot more exploratory, experimental, and expressionist compared to my work in the past. In the past, I was really trying to hone in on a clean, controlled style, which just doesn't match my life anymore as a mother. So more and more, I find that my time to work on paintings is quite endangered, and it's made me think that I need to find ways to paint faster. So that is where I'm at right now, and I think the next works you'll see, which is the body of work from which Pass You By hails, will kind of show you how other ways in which I'm on that exploration. So we'll hop over to the second slide. So here's some more pieces. Again, this is a new direction. It's all from a series called Matrescence that was featured at the University of South Dakota Galleries. So as was mentioned in my artist bio, I do dabble in collage. I've got one collage featured in this whole slideshow. So that first one on the left, it's called Thirst Trap, kind of very much a nod to reproduction, which just about always is what kicks off life with a baby. So all of the remaining artworks are life with a baby. So yes, at my USD show, that Matrescence show, there were collages along the vein of this, reproduction, having fun with imagery of reproduction. Okay, the rest of my images are all paintings, and they were completed fairly quickly, just because they needed to be, because I had a crying infant in the other room as I was preparing this show. So on the right, we see that image. It's my friend Emily with her son. He was having a reaction to a cat at my house, and I call this one La Pieta. So it's kind of humorous, but also it just shows just the way in which being a parent to a little one is just all consuming, and there's highs and lows and fatigue and joy, and there's just everything all the time. We can jump to the next slide. So more paintings from that Matrescence series. And these are actually large paintings. So the one on the left is 5 foot by 5 foot. The one on the right is, I believe it's 3 foot by 4 foot, or 3 foot by 4 foot. Yep. So again, just playing around, trying to find a speedier way of making this imagery. And then again, we have more just very recognizable images from early days of life with a little one. Everything in the series was from the perspective of the mother or whoever gave birth to the child, just since that was the perspective I knew best. So yes, here we have 2 breastfeeding mothers. And then if you want to hop to the last one, these ones I think are really fun, because as much as your baby is cute and wonderful and awe-inspiring, the rage of trying to wipe a booger off of their face, or and also the messes, are very real. So as much as these images are really beautiful to me, I think they also convey a lot of what I've been going through over this past year, and what, a lot of mothers and parents in the room can relate to as those early days. So yeah, in a nutshell, those were just some, I think those were about less than half of all of the paintings that were featured in that Matrescence series. And just to mention, to dial back a second, Matrescence is a word that just means the period of time in which a person is becoming a mother or a parent. So it includes psychological, social, and physical changes that you go through in that period, that postpartum period. Okay, so that's all I have on that topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And as I said, if you have questions for Amanda, we'll get back to her at the end. And so we'll move to Carol, and I'll be reading Carol's artist statement and then handing it over to her. So time and time again, Carol Gouy is drawn to the land and the sky. The land is a place for peace and meditation. However, it is also filled with energy and can never be contained by humans. One day, the sunset's beauty causes people to stop and drink in its wonder. The next, it warns us of a storm to come. And through it all, the horizon is there, calling us to the dawn of a new day, born anew and filled with hope.
Thanks, Abigail. Let's go to the next slide. I thought I would talk a little bit about process and materials because I'm not using traditional paint mediums to create these works. They're created out of wool. And so the top left photo that you see are the tools that I'm using to create each of the pieces. The white and blue pen contains needles that are used in the process. The blues and brown blobs, for lack of a better word, are the wool roving. So it's the wool after it has been processed from the sheet, but before it would be spun into yarn, and it is dyed. And then the gray pad is layers of felt, that you use as the base, because you stab the needles into the base fabric and lock them to create the images. And so the second top picture, the one on the right, is another tool that has 6 needles, and the blue is the base felt sheet that I'm using on the image, and then the white is the wool roving that I'm covering the image to create the image on the base. And then the bottom from left to right are showing I just did process photos to show you how the layers of yarn are built up to create the image of the landscape. And this was a photo that my friend Amy Phil, who many of you know, took on her way home, and that's why it's called Amy's Drive Home from this winter when the world was all white and gray and blue. So we can go on to the next one. These are a couple other images of recent work. The one on the left is of the river, and that was the first one I tried with including that reflection and the body of water with the sunset. The one on the right is one of those sunsets where you have the dark clouds and the dark land with just that band of color that can be so brilliant, that defines the horizon. If you want to go to the next one. And these are just other sunsets, but just showing the variety of the colors and why I'm continually fascinated by those colors and by the land. The one on the left was a photo I took between Vermillion and Yankton when the sky was just beautiful pinks and pale blues as the sun set. And then the one on the right is a photo that my mom took down in Beatrice of their farm. And again, just those different colors that can come, and the land being fallow and brown in the winter. There was a question in the chat about the dyes. I do not dye my own wool. I purchase the wool. Some people do dye their own wool, but I haven't expanded the process that far. I had been a painter, and when I saw some people working with wool felting, I was intrigued about that process, and I've always been fascinated about the conversation between art and craft, and high art and low art, and how materials can be used to define whether something is art or craft. And I wanted to challenge myself to see if I could use those materials to create images of the landscape, and I've been happy to say that I can. The images are built up with layer upon layer upon layer of color, just like you would with painting or drawing using other mediums. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 fibers, sometimes it's large swaths of color, sometimes I pull it all out and start over. So it's just that process of, like you would with paint, trying to figure out how you use those colors to define and create the illusion that I want to create using wool to show the landscape. And as far as the subject matter, I'm not a morning person, so I don't see very many sunrises. Our house also faces west. We're very lucky to look out over the Missouri River Valley. So every night I'm drawn to look to see what nature is giving me as a gift that night. And I have photo after photo after photo of those sunsets and just the colors and the celebrations and just how clouds can create a whole different illusion to the sky. And it's stunning. It takes my breath away over and over and over again. So I don't know that I'm ever going to be tired of creating the images. That's all I have. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. So we'll move to Susan, and Susan Heggestad is an artist drawn to print and paper making, fiber, embroidery, beading, installation, our physical experience of the world, and just who we think we are. Susan?
Thank you, Abigail. I first just want to thank everyone who's taken a little time this afternoon to join us. That's no small thing, especially when we're all virtual, and you may or may not have seen the exhibit yet, but if you have, fantastic, thank you. And thanks to the Art Museum and their staff for putting these chats together. It's really been a great addition, I think, to the Governor's Biennial, and I'm so appreciative to be able to participate. So with that, I will mention a response to something that came up before we got started, and that is the piece that is in this year's biennial is very different from the piece that I had in the last biennial. As Abigail mentioned, I do work in print and paper, and largely when I work in paper, I work sculpturally. And I have revisited paper sculpture since the pandemic, but it actually has always been there for me. When I transferred to USD, where I got my undergraduate degree, I fell into the influence of Professor Lloyd Menard, who was himself a paper maker as well as a printmaker. And I started dabbling in it right away. And I really love the tactility of paper making. Those of you who maybe have had the chance to, it can be very, very low tech, simple to, very, very involved and more elegant and refined. But basically you're sloshing around in water, right? You've got fibers floating and you're using screens of various sorts to capture that fiber, turn it into sheets of paper. And I did have the chance as a very young student to take a summer workshop with someone who introduced me to casting paper into either molds or over objects. So from the very beginning, I was also thinking about paper sculpturally, not just as a surface, right? So just want to preface that because it's actually hard for me to leave handmade paper flat. I have lots of it, but it's always going to get turned into sculpture in some way. And when I left Vermillion and went away to grad school, I didn't have access to paper making. And I did mostly print work, some large scale, two-dimensional work. But the minute I finished, I started making paper again. I made paper in my bathtub, and I made scores and scores of these shoulder casts, which is what is incorporated in the piece that's in this year's biennial. So not only is paper something I've actually been doing for most of my artistic career, but that actual cast, the shoulder cast, is a piece that I made initially in 2002 after I graduated from graduate school. So, I'll touch on that briefly, but I reuse things a lot, constantly in my work. So the piece itself is composed of a cast paper shoulder, but cascading from beneath it is additional handmade paper they also made in the early aughts that had simply been living in my studio for a very long period of time. And in the year leading up to and during the pandemic, I was unearthing lots of things. I mean, we all went through different stages, right? Some of us were probably like learning new languages, and other people were like trying to get in shape. And one of the things I did was I was like trying to revisit these things in my studio that had just been sitting in storage and taking up space. And that became a way of like keeping my mind occupied. And this piece was one of the first to come together of sculptural paper pieces that I've been working on since then, since 2020. So the piece on the right is also cast paper. And that cast had also already been created in the early aughts and had just been sitting, as we sometimes do. We set things aside. We don't know what we want to do with it. It came out in 2020. And I was spending a lot of time doing this very meticulous sort of embroidery, beading, a lot of handwork, essentially. So these pieces, and you can switch to the next slide, Abigail, and others that I've been creating since 2020. One, materially reflect an attempt to occupy myself, right? So I started diving into very, very time-consuming handcrafts. The beading especially takes a lot of time, and I am just beading often directly into the paper. And that's the nice thing about cast paper, is that it is tough enough to hold its shape, but malleable enough that I can do things like embroider and bead on it. And the other thing I've been thinking about while working on these pieces is stories that we tell ourselves. I've been interested in myth from the very beginning in my artistic journey. I've been interested in how our bodies function in the world and how we understand the world through our bodies. And I am very much a feminist artist as well. I am often thinking about gendered experiences, women's stories. And for me, this was a period where some of these things really started to fit together nicely, in that the history of women's handicraft, you know, as Carol mentioned, you know, like thinking about these things about what gets considered fine art, what gets called craft, how often there's a gendered sort of basis behind that. But also, some of you might remember how stark the early experience of the pandemic was, when we would hear these reports and see these pictures on the news of like crystal clear water suddenly, and cities that had like terrible pollution problems suddenly cleared, you know. So then I started thinking about these gendered perceptions of the landscape and of the world. And to me, that also ties really well into myth. So mythic stories started working their way into some of these pieces, and what resulted was an exhibition last spring. And you see a couple of details here, a show called On Her Temple's Ruins, and many of the pieces reference sort of mythic figures, especially feminine mythic figures. On the upper left there, the wall piece with the fabric flowing out, that is Lament for Persephone, that incorporates cast paper arms, but also fabric and plants and other things. The lower right, you can see a couple of pieces that incorporate sculpture, you know, and that's sort of where I'm at now, or incorporate furniture. Sorry, most of it's sculpture. You can skip one more slide here, Abigail. Thank you. And so where I'm working currently is actually even larger and incorporating furniture now. I'm very excited about this, although often out of my element, a little bit in over my head. I am not necessarily always sure where I'm going, but I'm recognizing that the connection to domesticity in our domestic sphere is also very intriguing to me, and talking about the stories that we tell ourselves about the world and how we operate in it. And this piece is also related to that whole series, Reliquary for Daphne. It's a dresser that was gifted to me, and during the pandemic, I spent, I don't know how many hours just sitting, carving the entire surface of the dresser with my old wood cut printmaking tools that had been sitting unused for some time. It's filled with nests that I've collected over the years. Ivy is growing over it, and there's another one of these busts alluding to the tree that Daphne, the mythic Daphne, was turned into as a quote unquote solution, right, for the dilemma that she found herself in. And I won't dive into the meaning of this so much, but the sculptural trail that I'm on right now is incorporating both paper as well as furniture, and I'm very excited to see where it goes. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll finish with Mark, and then we'll lead into our Q&A. Mark Stemwedel's artistic practice is grounded in representational and observational painting, through which he often explores a few different ideas at any given moment. In this body of work, he is interested in creating images that hover somewhere between the imagined and the remembered. The paintings are informed through vernacular photography and evolve from an intuitive and direct painting approach, welcoming unintentional and spontaneous opportunities to materialize. A process of asserting, negating, and reasserting his observations invites the possibility of unexpected moments to emerge. The suggestions of larger narrative or a shared history is often implied, but remains veiled and elusive.
Yes, well, thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to hear the background and the other artists talk about their work, and thank you for everybody that's listening. Yeah, so this body of work is, anybody that knows me, I kind of have different bodies of work that I kind of cycle through just out of keeping myself interested and engaged. And they all kind of are connected, one through the idea of paint. Ever since I was a teenager, I've been kind of drawn to paint itself. And so there's an exploration of the language in that material that I find fascinating. But there's also this idea of pictures and picture making that I find fascinating as well, that even though I often don't think about a specific meaning or intent as I'm making the image, it often kind of becomes embedded in there, whether it's just kind of something I'm thinking about myself or something that I'm experiencing, even though that might not be reflected in the image. And this painting here comes from a body of work that I have been kind of using old 35mm slides, this kind of thing, to as the kind of resource for the image, at least a place to start. And this one is probably a few paintings into that process. I think the first one was maybe one, it's the one in the next couple slides, which is actually comes from slides that I remember my grandmother having. And I remember the experience of always looking at these, and we never looked at them actually with a projector. I just always kind of looked at them through holding them up to the window. And there was a fascination about them just as things themselves. They were these little kind of colored jewel things, but it's a little kind of portal to this other world that you're looking at. And so I had that sort of kind of memory. And my brother had been scanning some old ones from our family and had shared the one from my mom, the one with the red is of my mom and her sister, my aunt. And I found it very fascinating to kind of paint that. But one of the things that I wanted is to kind of have some sort of remove from the image itself. And so I started doing research, and I found that you can buy, big boxes of other people's slides online. And so I have like thousands of them of other people's lives. And so to me, there's this interesting thing that they all look very familiar to me. If I look at all those slides, it seems like the world that was captured in my grandma's images, but it isn't. So there's this notion that it is a reality I kind of recognize, but just a little bit different. And so to me, there's an interesting kind of quality to that. And certainly the 35 millimeter slides is kind of a family documentation, happened over, about the 50s through maybe into the early 80s. So it captures a particular era, and it tends to capture a kind of similar view. And so to me, it's like a reality that's mine, but not quite like mine, just a little different. There's also the sense too that, I buy these and I assume they come from like real estate or estate sales and things like that. And so on some level, they're discarded images, and they're all these memories that were very precious to some group of people before, but then were just kind of let go. And, most often there's probably, there might be one other copy of the slides, but for the most part, it is the memory or the image. And so there's an interesting kind of quality there, the idea of this kind of unconsidered or unimportant kind of, or the discarding of it, that I think is really interesting. And so the notion of kind of using those as the kind of immediate resource fascinates me for lots of reasons. And then often it's just an opportunity to get started painting. And a lot of the stuff that happens in my painting, like Abigail said it from the statement, is a lot of back and forth. I'll put things in, I don't like them, they don't work. I'll take them out, I'll put something else in, I'll take that out. And so the painting becomes a dialogue of the time I spend making it. And then in the end, they're also become these, I tend to think of them as these little portals into this other world that once again is like something I recognize, but I'm not necessarily connected to. And then inevitably, like I said earlier, they become something maybe about myself. I talk about the idea of this kind of ambiguous narrative in which there isn't necessarily a direct story or anything connected to it, but there are, very much like in a poetic sense, there are ways that other people can kind of see them. And so that often kind of gets a little bit kind of focused depending on the title. Sometimes I'll make a title that maybe references an idea, or maybe a title that just is very confusing. But that idea of how we construct meaning out of looking at images like that is also really interesting to me. You can go on to the next slide. So there's the maybe one that is actually from my grandma's collection, and that's my mom, who is much older than her youngest sister, my aunt. And that was the kind of impetus that got me interested in that kind of imagery, and then wanting to not necessarily be connected directly to the images, to me is kind of opens things up. There's not an idea I hold on to so much if I don't have a really strong relationship to the image. And so they kind of come and go, and the paintings kind of, morph as I move through them. And just like Susan was talking, sometimes they'll get set aside for months at a time because I'm at a point where, it's kind of coming together, but it doesn't seem like it's really a cohesive kind of idea yet. And then I'll come back to them and add things and develop it further. And so a lot of these have that sense of kind of being reworked and developed. And that also is in terms of being interested in this idea of exploring what we mean by craft in terms of technique. And so a lot of these have moments where I apply and try to be very specific about technique, and then areas that I just kind of maybe glob paint on and let it drip or run, where it gets a little looser, messier, and to me there's an interesting kind of dialogue that happens in there. And you can go back to that first slide, the piece that's in the and so this one kind of happened once again, like it was sitting aside in my studio. And one of the things I've always been uncomfortable with is painting faces. And the one girl who has the big blob of paint on her face, I reworked that face lots of times, and I could never get it to where I liked it. And so at the end, I just plop paint on, and that's kind of one of my strategies. If I end up struggling with something and it doesn't seem to want to resolve, just put a big blob of paint on it. And to me, there's often this kind of language, once again, that kind of gets developed in obscuring something like that or veiling something like that. And even in relating to this image where, some of the people at the party, you assume it's a birthday party, are turned away from you. And so you are kind of in this world, but you're also kind of a voyeur as the viewer, kind of looking into the world. But then once again, it's not all available to you. As the viewer, you have to kind of either kind of reconcile what's going on or create your own idea of what's going on. And This Is Not My Party is, kind of, to me, a reference of always kind of feeling like an outsider throughout my life, just in general, of not feeling connected to socially, things like that. And so although they're kind of removed from me in terms of imagery and I'm not connected to them, I always find a kind of idea that I connect with in there in some way. And that's the painting telling me something about my life. One of the things I talk about to my students is that idea that the painting should have a voice in what it wants to be in the world as well. And so that's me often kind of allowing the painting to kind of assert a certain presence in the world, because it has to exist in the world too. So it should have some say on what it wants to be. And so those kind of ambiguous narratives or something that is really kind of undefined, I often find is a way for the viewer to have to reconcile those, and kind of all of a sudden the viewer is making the meaning, which, very much like how you think about your dreams, how you interpret your dreams says a lot more about you than what the actual dream is, or the images in your dreams. And so how you construct that meaning is a little bit of a view into how you think about your life. And you can go forward now too. And so this one, both of these, once again, come from slides that, once again, have been discarded and kind of reclaimed by me. And so I have lots of these. And I find that sense of painting does that, but I'm also very much connected to the spaces that it makes, and I don't necessarily think of them as surrealistic, but there is this kind of, sense of a world that, maybe is dreamlike, but, maybe is real. And to me, that interesting kind of difference between memory and reality. And so once again, you could think of these as my memories. They're very much look like my grandma's house and things, but they're not. They're somebody else's grandmother's house. And so that kind of difference and contrast, I think, is really interesting to me. And connects a lot of the ideas of other bodies of work that I explore in different ways too. I think that's all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone for sharing a little bit. I'm really appreciative that we had such a wide range of media today in this one. I'm going to stop sharing so we can move into the conversational part of this.
Neha asks, may I ask which is the thickest painting you've made to date? Since you said you make layers of fiber.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Interestingly enough, they really stay about the same depth. You know, maybe when I'm done, 1/4 of an inch, because as you are using the needles and embedding the fibers in the base felt, it flattens out that base felt. So actually the work kind of expands vertically and horizontally and gets a little bit larger, but the depth of the work really doesn't change over time. It would be just a fraction.
Thanks, Carol. Susan, Steve Randall asks, do you cast from live models or to live models?
Yeah, and I threw that back out in chat, but I cast plaster generally. I'm more comfortable casting paper into plaster molds. You know, playing around, it could cast paper over a hand or something, but the time it takes for it to dry just seems onerous. So I generally work with plaster.
Stephen also asks to Mark, do you find that viewers relate personally to your work on some level?
Yeah, I think in the same way that I do, you know, especially if you've grown up in the Midwest, you know, I find, especially if you're my age or, you know, or older, once again, there was an era of people, kind of regular people, using slides for taking family photos and things like that. And so all of the ones I have, there's probably like 5, 6 big collections from different families, but you could mix all of those slides up and they're all really the same thing, because we also take photos of similar things, birthday parties, Christmas, dinners, things like that. And so using that, I think there's a connection there, but also the approach of kind of keeping things ambiguous in terms of any sort of specific meaning, I think opens it up for others to kind of have an engagement with the work where they have their own kind of dialogue with what's happening.
Mark. Karen agrees. She says there's really a familiarity to the slides that you've collected from strangers. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or drop them in the chat.
I have one question. Steve Randall here. It's interesting, your slides. I have a bunch of slides too from my past, and I've always thought it would be fun to put those into a storyboard. You could tell a story with multiple slides, and maybe they don't all come from the same event or time in your life, but you could almost tell a story. And I wonder if you would do that in painting, or would you actually just use the slides with a projector or something to tell that story?
Well, to me, I've kind of made the rule that I would never actually show the slides, because then then all of a sudden there is this kind of relationship to the slide that the viewer has that they don't have now. And so I do have a lot of fun kind of looking through them, because once again, for me, the experience of looking at the slides reminds me of being a kid at my grandma's house and rummaging through her box of slides and holding them up to the window and looking at them. And so to me, there is a lot of fun in that. And you can see through them, like, oh, here, these people went on their trip to the Grand Canyon, and then they come back and you see them go to have Christmas and things like that. But I really kind of purposefully don't connect those to the paintings in a public way, because I don't want the viewer necessarily to have that other kind of concrete idea of what the image is and how I've changed it. I just want them to have the experience of the image that's there.
I have a question for Mark. Of all those slides that you have available to you, what makes you pick one to turn into a painting?
My rule is 100% intuition, but I don't think about it. If image kind of connects with me and I respond to it, I'll start doing some drawings of it. If it still connects to me in some way, I'll take it further into a painting. But in the same way, I've made a conscious decision not to be too decisive. I'll just let the image kind of connect with me and move from there.
Thank you.
I'm wondering when Carol started using felt. I didn't even realize that you worked with felt until the last Governor's Biennial. And I was like, what is this? Is it recent, or have you been doing this for a while?
No, it was recent. And I think it was also, something that came out of the pandemic and, thinking about it earlier and being always intrigued, like you had talked about, by traditional women's crafts and arts and the concepts of how women were trained in earlier times and what that said about the society and the value of women within the culture. And it just was something to challenge myself and to move away from the toxicity of painting. Not having a studio outside of my home and worried about living and working in the same space and trying to find something that I could still create paintings, but not have to worry about the toxicity. And I've always liked working small. And so to be able to work on my lap or at a table, I like that intimacy and that connection to the materials. I've never been one that wanted to work big and expansive. It's always drawing things in closer.
Well, they look like you've been doing them for decades, so that's why I was curious.
Thank you. Well, I had a question for you, Susan. When you're working on the paper and you're doing embroidery and beading, while you say it is a softer material, it's not as flexible or porous as fabric. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I should qualify that it doesn't work exactly the same way. So for instance, I'm doing more paper embroidery right now, and I'm embroidering just on prints as well. So, I mean, they are flat, but you have to poke your holes ahead of time. You can't move in and out with a regular needle the way you do with fabric. And in fact, so it becomes a little more like a tapestry in that sense of like, very meticulous kind of like in and out. The lines are somewhat already plotted out. The beading, I'm using a regular pointed needle and not necessarily poking all of the holes, but it takes longer to bead onto the cast paper than it would if I were just beading onto fabric. Yeah, some of those pieces, and I didn't include a couple of paperworks that are like almost entirely covered in beads. Those are hours and hours and hours. But my work has become more, I've learned to embrace the meditativeness of some of those processes as part of it. I've been thinking, in fact, especially since the pandemic, about the train of women's work kind of being equated with like the emotional labor of a culture, and like all that, you know, these histories of things that women lovingly create, hours and hours and hours of time, and there's been something restorative for me personally to do that, but also that it itself has meaning about how the women in so many cultures just put so much into certain handicrafts.
I had a question for Amanda too, if nobody else has a question.
Sure.
When we were, I think it was the background when you gave your presentation of the water painting, the swimming painting.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that new body of work? And you said the first painting, you weren't going to do the others in a similar way, and maybe what's attracting you to the pool and water and reflections.
Well, okay. So I did flip around and I started working on it. So my room is a mess, but yeah. Okay. So what is attracting me to this? Well, my goal when I started this painting was to be loose and expressive again, but it got tied out all over again. But I am very out of practice. I barely painted anything since November. So I think I just fell back into this old comfort of mine, which is zoom in, be really tight, find the details. Yay, yay, yay. Yeah. So yeah, when I continue to explore these water paintings, hopefully they won't be just like this. I mean, this took so much time, but I want it to be loose. Not doing what I want.
Amanda, how do you think about that sense of time of making? Because one of the things that interests me is this, going back to the idea of pictures, and pictures and photography is so immediate and so ubiquitous in the world. This idea of an image that takes time. How do you think about that as you develop? You mentioned you want to work a little quicker, but still a painting of that size and some of the other ones that you've done are very large. And even if you're working quickly, it takes time. Talk a little bit about how you think about that sense of time.
Well, I have no time right now. But I don't know, in the past, when I had more time to just really become obsessed with a piece, I guess, I didn't mind putting 50 hours into a piece. It was very meditative. And then I always felt like, the piece was infused with hours upon hours of energy. And that was really special and magical. But yeah, now I'm just really interested in almost impressions. And I mean, I was exploring that a bit more about 6 months ago, or whenever that was, when I was preparing for that USD show. And I was having fun with that. And something about sitting down and creating a piece in one go, for example, sitting down, okay, I've got 4 hours, whatever, I popped out a piece. I guess I kind of prefer it in some ways. It's hard to channel the same energy when you bring the same piece out again and again and again, so maybe that's kind of why I keep leaning back into being studious and tight, is when I pulled out a piece 12 different times. It's an interesting question. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting how when your life becomes busier, time obviously becomes much more precious, and, that studio time, much, much more precious. And oftentimes that is where things get cut. And so capturing your experience of the immediacy of your life, especially with a young child, it's all in the moment. So it'd be interesting to think about how that relates to the way you paint and the way you think about the time relationships in your painting. Especially the one of your baby where it's kind of animated and it's moving and capturing multiple moments.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I'm going to revisit, hopefully. I don't know, I think the pools popped out because I think when I was returning to the studio, I was maybe a little burnt out on other ones. So I'm wanting to paint anything besides that. But it is something I want to return back to. I had one friend so they're a stay-at-home mom with 2 little children, and it's a lot. And she thanked me when she saw that piece as well as some of my other pieces. She just was so excited because she's always been a writer, and she was like, oh, it's so nice to see fine art that relates to what I'm going through right now, because I feel like when a lot of people look at the topic of motherhood, they think, oh, that's so cute, or like, the way they think about it is sentimental, when I think about it as, like it feels like stress and like violence. And it's something so transformative and huge. So she thought it was really cool to see it portrayed in this way in fine art. Well, I'll be back. I'll be back to that topic.
Great. Well, thanks, you four. Are there any final questions? We're kind of closing in on our hour here.
I'm just wondering, Susan, are you buying furniture from thrift stores, or how are you amassing furniture to work with? Are you making it?
I am short of crafting furniture by hand. I am no way equipped nor knowledgeable about that. I am, thrifting. Trash furniture is always appealing, because I'm such a reuser of materials anyway. It's actually been kind of gratifying, although it's not really great for my hoarding tendencies, because now I have 2 studios, and one of them is it's a giant commercial garage space downtown Vermillion that is half filled with furniture now that I need to figure out what it's going to become. But that place is exciting to me. I think partly too, I'd like to dwell on the idea of reincarnation, and like breathing new life into things is part of my interest in the mythology. Like, I think we need new stories, we need new myths, we need new ways of being in the world. And so it satisfies that sort of itch to, I don't know, it's also very self-indulgent, because those things still just sit packaged in my studio. Even once they're turned into art, you hope that they go out into the world. But right now I'm just focusing on how I can breathe new life into pieces that in some cases people were ready to trash.
Well, thank you. And we have some kind comments from others that this was very informative and people are appreciative of your passions. Yes, and Pat says, what an interesting group of artists, and I'm inclined to agree. This was a fun one.
Thanks again for hosting this, South Dakota Art Museum. It's a very nice opportunity.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the beautiful exhibition. Your installation was really fascinating, and the way the works communicated with each other, I thought was really well done. So thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a very well designed exhibition. It's wonderful.
The fun thing with it is you get to see it in 4 different ways. We have 3 more venues to go, right? So keep visiting it throughout the state through next spring. So.
Yep, and if you haven't seen it in Brookings yet, you have a few more weeks, and we'd love to see you.
Yeah. Thank you all, and thanks to everybody that attended. We hope you all have a good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.
And the show closes May 14th.